Please join me in welcoming Don Luskins on I Am John Galt. Don?
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. There is one substantial inaccuracy. I actually am John Galt. But you all are too. And that's the secret of Ayn Rand's enduring popularity. Her books are lessons. Her books are self-help books. Her books are guides to how to live. We can all be John Galt. We can all be heroes. Just read what's in there carefully. My new book, I Am John Galt, is a reader's guide to Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead to help you learn to live like an Ayn Rand hero, and at the same time to teach you what happens in the world when there are Ayn Rand-type villains out there. Now, I assume that everyone in this room has probably heard of Ayn Rand. How many people here have read the Atlas Shrugged? I'm actually stunned to not see every single hand in the room go up. Okay, here we got two big thumbs up for the virtue of selfishness here. Fantastic. Okay. If you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, in a way I envy you because you have before you a fantastic treat. The first reading of Atlas Shrugged is a transformative experience. In poll after poll, when Americans are asked, what is the book that influences you the most? Atlas Shrugged is always in the top 2 or 3. The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand's other masterpiece, is also always in the top 2 or 3. I got to tell you, there's a message in that. It is that we libertarians, we individualists, one of the curses of being an individualist is we tend to sometimes think that we're alone. I can tell you, I certainly feel that way. I live in Northern California, where a libertarian can feel very, very alone. I live just south of San Francisco, so I'm not literally in Nancy Pelosi's congressional district, but I can smell it from where I live. And I tell you, I can feel very alone. So it is fantastic to be here at FreedomFest. I thank Mark Skousen for hawking me for years to come here. It's great to see that there are like-minded people. They just don't happen to live in my zip code. So back to Ayn Rand. Atlas Shrugged was written 54 years ago. It is probably the best-selling book in the English language, which is an amazing thing. It sells more copies every year. It sold more copies last year than ever before in its history, and when it first came out in 1957, it was a bestseller then. Now, there's a narrative about that that's being promoted by the conservative community, and we all know that's different than the libertarian community, saying that the reason Ayn Rand is suddenly having this surge in popularity is because Atlas Shrugged portrays a world that is eerily like our world. So for those of you who haven't read it, let me just tell you what that world is. It is a world of decay, of economic collapse, of corruption, of despair, of things just getting worse and worse, of an invasive parasitic government that takes over private capital, and everything it does makes things worse, and when it makes things worse, it just does them again. Well, yeah, I mean, that does sound an awful lot like our world. So you could almost say that Ayn Rand had some amazing prophetic powers, that she's the conservative movement's own Nostradamus. So we ought to embrace her ideas. Now, we all, those of you who studied Ayn Rand's life, know that the conservative movement has always loathed Ayn Rand. She is an atheist. The conservative movement is riddled with religious threads, so she's never been popular with conservatives. Well, it's politically expedient to bring her into the tent for a little while right now. We're going to talk in a minute about how that is actually a bit of a misreading of Rand. The world described in Atlas Shrugged talks about a lot more things than what's wrong with big government. It also talks a lot about what's wrong with big corporations. So we're going to get into all that. But on the surface, the narrative of the conservatives is actually very good. You read Atlas Shrugged, and I'm telling you, sometimes you just think like you're reading from today's headlines. One of the most memorable villains in Atlas Shrugged is a fellow named Wesley Mooch. Now, if you've seen the recent movie of Atlas Shrugged, they chose to pronounce his name Mouch. I just don't get that. I mean, when I read Atlas Shrugged for the first time in high school, it was definitely Mooch. Okay, so it's always going to be Mooch for me. We have our own real-world Wesley Mooch. His name is Barney Frank. Now, I don't normally use notes, and I apologize for waving these notes around, but I have them because I want to be able to make exact quotations without error here. You might remember that one of the refrains in Atlas Shrugged is every time Wesley Mooch did some ridiculous thing that made the economy even worse, he and his cronies would meet in Washington, and they'd say, "We need broader powers." Okay, we know government is the only enterprise that when it makes a mistake, repeats the mistake bigger. Well, let me quote Barney Frank. After the collapse of the U.S. housing industry and the U.S. mortgage industry, a collapse that more than any other single individual he engineered from his position in the U.S. Congress, getting Fannie and Freddie to loan money to and subsidize loans of money to people who couldn't possibly ever own a home, could never pay back the mortgages. That was all Barney Frank's work. When asked what we should do to clean up the mess, he said, quote unquote, "The way to cure that is to give us broader powers." You can't make this stuff up. But the amazing thing is Ayn Rand did 54 years ago. Frank is more like Mooch than you can imagine. Starting to get into the microstructure of Atlas Shrugged here, but you might remember that Mooch got into government in the first place. He started as a lobbyist. He was the lobbyist for Henry Reardon, who's one of the great heroes of Atlas Shrugged. He gets into government by betraying Reardon. Well, that's a certain kind of corruption. This is one of these things where when liberals are corrupt, it doesn't get very well reported. So you might be surprised to know that Barney Frank was censured by the Congress for a scandal in which he ended up admitting to have used male prostitutes and paid them and sustained them in his apartment in Washington as a base of operations for them. Did you know that as a member of Congress regulating Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, he placed one of his gay lovers as a financial analyst at Fannie Mae? Now, as a libertarian, I have no objection whatsoever to his sexual preferences. I have a serious objection to corruption. We're talking about a deeply, deeply corrupt man whose corruption very nearly destroyed the world. Another villain from Atlas Shrugged, alive and well in our world, is Alan Greenspan. Now, what character in Atlas Shrugged is Alan Greenspan like? Anybody remember Dr. Robert Statler? Kind of a minor character, but a very key character. He was one of two college professors who was a mentor to the young John Galt. And when Galt was still a young man, Statler left academia to found the State Science Institute so he could do his experimental physics, his theoretical physics, free of the grubby support of capitalists and people who pay tuition and things like that. And John Galt disowned him. He damned him. Now, at the climax of Atlas Shrugged, when the world finally totally goes down the drain, the climactic scene is when the government, having expropriated Dr. Statler's work in physics to create a weapon of mass destruction, this weapon actually almost accidentally detonates in Dr. Statler's presence, and the description of his death at the hands of this weapon that his science inadvertently created is one of the most moving passages in Atlas Shrugged. Alan Greenspan is Dr. Robert Statler. He is the most damned because he knew better. It's one thing to make these mistakes out of ignorance or pure power lust like Barney Frank did. Alan Greenspan knew better. Alan Greenspan, for 30 years, was a close associate, an apostle of Ayn Rand. He was with Ayn Rand the day she died in 1982. Best friends forever. He had no excuse. He knew better. When he first went to Washington in 1976, as President Gerald Ford's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Ayn Rand and her husband Frank O'Connor were right there in the White House as he was sworn in by Gerald Ford. Why didn't Ayn Rand damn him? She actually said to the press that Alan is my man in Washington. Well, she didn't live long enough to see him become the chairman of the Federal Reserve. She probably thought then that he was sort of a double agent for capitalism, right in the heart of Washington. Well, it sounds good if you say it fast, but if any of you guys have ever spent any time in Washington, just the atmosphere there is an addictive drug. Washington is like an aquarium, but instead of being filled with water, it's filled with power. And after you've swum around in it for a while, you want more of it. And Alan Greenspan did. The Federal Reserve Chairman is the most highly empowered, most unaccountable economic czar on planet Earth. It's better than the economic czar. It's master of the universe. And an Ayn Rand acolyte got that job. Well, the rest is history. It worked. He had an 18-year run as chairman. Seemed like it was okay for a while. A lot of bad things happened on his watch, and it seemed he always bailed us out. I remember seeing him on the cover of Time magazine, where the headline was, "Chairman of the Save the World Committee." Well, I met Greenspan recently in Washington. Let me tell you what happens when you go into his office in Washington and meet Alan Greenspan. You see a shriveled little man who's wearing a sign saying, "Broken." He's 85 years old. His mind is still totally there. His spirit isn't there. He's a broken man. Look, I'd be broken too if I was hauled before Congressman Henry Waxman. You ever seen Henry Waxman? This guy looks like a combination of the original Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney Sr. and Mortimer Snerd. Waxman grilled Greenspan, got him to admit that all that self-interest stuff, all that virtue of selfishness stuff, all that individual self-interest, self-regulation stuff didn't really work very well in the credit crisis, did it? And Greenspan said, yeah, I guess it didn't work so well. He basically recanted. So when I met him, I said, did you really recant? I kind of saw it on YouTube. And he said, no, not at all. You completely misunderstood. That's completely taken out of context. Well, no, it's not. It's just like a year had passed. So I had my copy of You Like the Virtue of Selfishness. My favorite Ayn Rand nonfiction book is Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which has 2 chapters written by Alan Greenspan, one of which is called Gold and Political Freedom. And I have a first edition copy of that with Rand's signature on it, and I brought it with me to my meeting with Greenspan to get him to sign it. And I said, do you still stand by this? Should I be asking you to sign this? He said, every word. I stand by every word Ayn Rand ever said. I stand by every word I ever said for Ayn Rand. It's all stood the test of time. Well, just go to YouTube. That isn't what he said to Henry Waxman. So one of the lessons you can learn from Atlas Shrugged is if you don't want to end up being a broken man, have a little integrity. Stick by your guns. Now, one of the secrets of Atlas Shrugged's enduring popularity is that, yes, it describes this nightmare world with these villains like this, but it's also a profoundly inspiring book. It's the best of times and the worst of times. The heroes in it are absolutely inspiring. Who can read that book and not identify with characters like Dagny Taggart and Hank Rearden and Francisco de Cunha and Ragnar Daneskold? It's a very, very inspiring book. And I'm here to tell you that our world, as bleak as it seems, is absolutely populated by those kinds of heroes. Now, like all heroes, some heroes are tragic heroes, like some of the heroes in Atlas Shrugged, in fact. So let's look at some of the heroes of Atlas Shrugged. Henry Rearden, the steel tycoon who invented a revolutionary new metal, Rearden metal, had it taken away from him by the government that was blackmailing him. Ring any bells? How about Bill Gates? Exactly like Henry Rearden. College dropout, created a revolutionary technology that transformed all our lives, extended all our wealth, became the richest man in the world in the process, well-deserved. Then in 1999, using tax dollars that Bill Gates himself had sent to Washington, Washington sent to Bill Gates a lawsuit from the Department of Justice seeking to break up Microsoft on antitrust grounds, which is just a polite way of saying because you've succeeded too much. Now, just like Rearden, when that happened, Gates couldn't be bothered to dirty his hands going and hanging out with those yucky people in Washington. I don't blame him. Microsoft was a gigantic company. I think it only had like 2 or 3 lobbyists at that time. Boy, did he learn his lesson. He kind of won the suit. He settled it on fairly favorable terms. But Microsoft is still struggling with the echoes of it. I mean, they're still straightening out their antitrust issues in Europe, for example. But there's another broken man. He stepped down as CEO as soon as the suit was settled. Seen the Microsoft stock price lately? You can draw a little X on the Microsoft stock price where Bill Gates stepped down. That X is way above the current stock price. It hasn't traded there again for 11 years. It's a broken stock because Bill Gates is a broken man. Bill Gates created the world's largest fortune. If he'd stayed at the helm, he could have taken the world's largest fortune and made it even larger. Now he's giving it away. What do we call this? Doctors call this Stockholm Syndrome, when you identify with your kidnappers. Our culture vilified Bill Gates for making money. Now we love him because he's giving away money. That's sending a wrong message to our children. So what's the lesson of Bill Gates? There's a light lesson and a dark lesson. The light lesson is you can drop out of school and become the richest man in the world. And by the way, the spillover effect to all of us, people rail about income inequality. Let me tell you the good side of it about income inequality. When there is a guy as rich as Bill Gates, that sets the bar. That means that something is possible for everybody that wasn't possible until he proved it could be done. It was like when the first guy who broke the 4-minute mile. Thank you, Bill Gates, for showing what can be done. It can still happen in America. The other lesson of Bill Gates is watch your back. Don't make the mistake of ignoring Washington. Let me switch to the Fountainhead for a minute and talk about a hero from the Fountainhead. He happens to be my favorite character from the whole Ayn Rand canon. It is Howard Rourke, the rebellious architect, the ultimate individual, I think one of the most fascinating characters in all of literature. From page 1 to page 1,000, or however long that book is, he's the only major hero in the history of literature who undergoes absolutely no transformation during the book. He's presented as perfect on page 1 and perfect on the last page. And what is it that's perfect about him? He is an absolute individual. And every step he makes, every success he has, every trial he faces, is faced with absolute, utter integrity in his individualism and a sheer joy in his work. In our world, that man is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. He's an orphan. Guy who just came out of nowhere, just like Howard Rourke. Think what he accomplished simply because he loves it. He's just obsessed with this stuff. There's like toys for him to play with, a canvas for him to paint on. When he founded Apple Computer, he completely transformed the computer industry from a command and control mainframe model to an individual empowerment desktop model. He made that happen. A few years later, he bought an obscure little digital rendering company on a fire sale when George Lucas needed to get rid of it, called Pixar. He had this idea that this could be used to create full-length animated movies. He thought that would be pretty cool. He'd like to see a movie like that. So he found this guy named John Lasseter, and they worked together on a movie that would eventually be called Toy Story. They spent so many years on it, and so much of Steve Jobs' money, he came near to personal bankruptcy funding it. They almost discontinued Toy Story at the last minute. Finally, he did a Hail Mary pass and did a deal with Disney to get it distributed. Toy Story is now one of the top 10 biggest grossing movies of all time. It's had 2 sequels, which are also on the top 10 list of biggest grossing movies of all time. And he did it not to make money, he just thought it was cool. I remember meeting Steve Jobs in the kiddie pool in a resort in Hawaii years back when we both had young children, and I went with my daughter into the pool, and Steve Jobs is in there. Of course, I recognize him. He sticks out his hand and he says, "Hi, my name's Steve. I make movies. What do you do?" Look, man, the secret is just love your work. What else has he done? He created iTunes and the iPod. That's his third industry. So he completely transformed computers, completely transforms movies. Then he completely transforms music. And he's not done. Then he creates the iPhone and completely transforms telephony. And now he's created the iPad and gone back and retransformed the first industry he transformed, computing. So don't tell me there aren't heroes in this world. You know, on that panel yesterday, I was the only optimist in the room. Well, look, you can't meet Steve Jobs and not be optimistic. That's what's possible. I know there are a lot of problems in this world, but there are a lot of solutions, too. Another great Silicon Valley figure is a man named T.J. Rogers. He's the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor. I think he's been a FreedomFest guest in the past. I don't think he's here this year. If you own a cell phone, crack it open, look at all those little miracles inside it. Quite a few of them probably come from Cypress Semiconductor. They're a leader in that field. T.J. Rogers is like the character in Atlas Shrugged, Francisco d'Anconia. Remember, d'Anconia showed up in critical scenes in Atlas Shrugged whenever the main heroes were having a moment of doubt, needed a little moral clarity. He would show up to tell them what's what. One of the individual empowerment desktop model. He made that happen. A few years later, he bought an obscure little digital rendering company on a fire sale when George Lucas needed to get rid of it, called Pixar. He had this idea that this could be used to create full-length animated movies. He thought that would be pretty cool. He'd like to see a movie like that. So he found this guy named John Lasseter, and they worked together on a movie that would eventually be called Toy Story. They spent so many years on it, and so much of Steve Jobs' money, he came near to personal bankruptcy funding it. They almost discontinued Toy Story at the last minute. Finally, he did a Hail Mary pass and did a deal with Disney to get it distributed. Toy Story is now one of the top 10 biggest grossing movies of all time. It's had 2 sequels, which are also on the top 10 list of biggest grossing movies of all time. And he did it not to make money, he just thought it was cool. I remember meeting Steve Jobs in the kiddie pool in a resort in Hawaii years back when we both had young children, and I went with my daughter into the pool, and Steve Jobs is in there. Of course, I recognize him. He sticks out his hand and he says, "Hi, my name's Steve. I make movies. What do you do?" Look, man, the secret is just love your work. What else has he done? He created iTunes and the iPod. That's his third industry. So he completely transformed computers, completely transforms movies. Then he completely transforms music. And he's not done. Then he creates the iPhone and completely transforms telephony. And now he's created the iPad and gone back and re-transformed the first industry. He transformed computing. So don't tell me there aren't heroes in this world. You know, on that panel yesterday, I was the only optimist in the room. Well, look, you can't meet Steve Jobs and not be optimistic. That's what's possible. I know there are a lot of problems in this world, but there are a lot of solutions, too. Another great Silicon Valley figure is a man named T.J. Rogers. He's the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor. I think he's been a FreedomFest guest in the past. I don't think he's here this year. If you own a cell phone, crack it open, look at all those little miracles inside it. Quite a few of them probably come from Cypress Semiconductor. They're a leader in that field. T.J. Rogers is like the character in Atlas Shrugged, Francisco d'Anconia. Remember, d'Anconia showed up in critical scenes in Atlas Shrugged whenever the main heroes were having a moment of doubt, needed a little moral clarity. He would show up to tell them what's what. One of the most often quoted passages in all of Ayn Rand is Francisco's famous speech about the nobility of money, where he's at a cocktail party and some heiress says money is the root of all evil. And he then goes on for 20 pages proving that the money is the root of all good. T.J. Rogers is that kind of guy. He's completely politically incorrect. He's a CEO of a major company who says things that CEOs aren't supposed to get away with, and he does it by having absolute moral clarity. So I'm going to quote some T.J. for you. Like many CEOs, he's constantly under assault by politically correct people trying to get them to have more gender diversity, more religious diversity, more racial diversity on their boards and in their workforce. A couple years back, a Franciscan nun named Mary Gormley, Sister Gormley, attacked Cypress Semiconductor, insisting that they diversify their board more for gender and race. TJ responded in the Wall Street Journal, "Choosing a board of directors based on race and gender is a lousy way to run a company. Cypress will never do it Furthermore, we will never be pressured into it because bowing to well-meaning special interest groups is an immoral way to run a company, given all the people it would hurt. We simply cannot allow arbitrary rules to be forced on us by organizations that lack business expertise. I would rather be labeled as a person who is unkind to religious groups than as a coward who harms his employees and investors by mindlessly following high-sounding but false standards of right and wrong. And he survived. In 1999, Jesse Jackson came to Silicon Valley. It was part of this program he had at that time where he went to Wall Street and declared Wall Street to be racist. Then he went to Detroit and declared the automobile industry to be racist. Then he came to Silicon Valley and declared technology to be racist. TJ, whose company at that time had 35% minority employees, every one of whom was a shareholder, and 44% of whose executive VPs were minorities, gave a quote to one news station, and I say, quote unquote, "Jesse Jackson reminds me of a seagull. He flies in, craps all over everything, and then flies out." Okay, lesson here is simple. Just believe it. Have the courage of your conviction. Just say it. If they sense weakness, they'll kill you. Don't show any weakness. Just believe what you believe. So these heroes I've been talking about are businessmen. And a lot of people misread Atlas Shrugged to say that what it's really telling you is that all businessmen are good and all government people are evil. Well, go back and read Atlas Shrugged. Who's the main villain of Atlas Shrugged? The main villain of Atlas Shrugged is a businessman. It's James Taggart, the president of Taggart Transcontinental. The great tension that runs throughout the book is the conflict between James Taggart, the bad executive, and his sister, Dagny Taggart, the good railroad executive. All of the political machinations executed by Wesley Mooch and all the other government parasites in Atlas Shrugged are because James Taggart is pulling the strings with his own crony capitalist games. So in our book, when we were looking for an analogy to James Taggart, we happened on a fellow named Angelo Mozillo. Is that a name that's familiar to anybody? He's the founder and former CEO of a company, I guess we should call it the former company, Countrywide Financial. Countrywide Financial was the poster child for everything you could possibly do wrong in subprime lending. After Mozillo secretly sold his stock in Countrywide in 2007, the same week he gave a shareholder presentation saying that everything was fine. From that point, 7 months later, the company lost 80% of its value, at which point it was acquired by Bank of America, and I'm sure they thought they were really getting quite a bargain. Well, it turned out there was no bargain big enough to buy Countrywide Financial. Not only did it carry all kinds of unknown liabilities, but Bank of America is still paying. 2 weeks ago, they paid $8.7 billion to settle lawsuits and regulatory complaints about the fraudulent documentation of Countrywide mortgages. Let me tell you just how fraudulent some of these mortgages were, just for anybody who thinks that all business is noble. It's not. A lot of business is. And look, some government is. A lot of business isn't. Countrywide lent